It is the last Tuesday of October in the year 1815, and the rain is coming down across the Bolton Abbey Road in long grey sheets that hiss against the stones of the wall. The light is going. It is the kind of failing wet October dusk in which the bare oaks on either side of a Yorkshire avenue stand black and dripping against a sky the colour of pewter, and a single horseman, far down the track, is no more than a darker smudge in the weather. He is a tall man, this rider, mud-spattered to the knees, his shoulders set against the wet. He sits a tired bay horse with the unforced ease of a soldier who has done a great deal of his life in the saddle. Over a dark blue undress cavalry tailcoat, a coat without epaulets and without gold, a sold-out colour now, he wears a heavy dark grey caped travelling greatcoat, 3 short capes lying one upon the other across his broad shoulders, and his plain dark brown beaver hat is pulled low against the rain. Beneath the hat, his thick dark chestnut brown hair is wet at the collar. His dark hazel green eyes are narrowed against the weather. The weathered tan of 4 years on the peninsula has not yet faded from his face. He is 6 feet 2 and broad in the shoulder and lean in the hip. He is 33. He is a lieutenant colonel of the 18th Hussars who sold out only 6 weeks ago, and he is, against every expectation he has held in his life, the new 6th Duke of Ravenscourt. His name is Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt. He has not seen Raysbury Hall in 11 years, cut now, narrator quick, to a small candlelit kitchen at the far end of that long avenue, bare-flagged stones, a great range hot in its hood, the smell of onions and damp stone and the back passage. A long pine table scrubbed almost white. At the table, alone, stands a slight young woman in a plain, coarse, undyed linen kitchen dress, her sleeves pushed to the elbows, a coarse white apron over the front. Her dark chestnut brown hair is pulled back tight in a working knot under a plain white linen cap, with a single small wisp escaping at the temple. Her ivory pale skin is faintly flushed at the cheekbone, where a small natural beauty mark sits high on the right cheek. Her clear smoke-grey eyes are lowered to the board. She is 22. She's 5 feet 4, slender, and upright as a duchess. The household calls her Annie Cross. The parish register, in another country, in another language, calls her something quite different. She is chopping winter onions in the candlelight, and the heavy boots of a strange man are coming along the side passage toward her kitchen door. There are mistaken identity stories that begin in a ballroom and unfold over a fan. There are mistaken identity stories that begin at a christening register, and there are rarer, slower, mistaken identity stories that begin at a kitchen table in a wet October dusk, when a soaked hussar in a caped greatcoat takes the only woman he has ever asked anything of for a kitchen maid, and is mistaken in his turn by every assumption he has ever held. Her name, the longer one, was Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, only daughter of the late Henri Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, Comte de Saint-Vrain of Picardy. Her father had been a moderate man in an immoderate season, a Girondin who would not leave France for the émigré armies, who believed, with the patient stubbornness of a country gentleman, that he might yet be of use to his tenants and his small village in the storm. And the storm, on the 17th of August in 1793, had carried him away, in the brief and terrible manner that nobody at Raysbury would name aloud now. His English-born wife, Marianne Waverley, was 8 months gone with child when the news reached her. She left France within the fortnight, by way of Hamburg, with the help of her own father's old land agent, who had had the wit to draw a small bag of guineas out of the bank in time, and to see her aboard a packet at Cuxhaven, and Marianne reached the parsonage at Raysbury in the Dale, with her father's small pearl ring and a single trunk, and no other possession in the world. There, on the 15th of November in 1793, She was delivered of a daughter, and the old Reverend Philip Hawthorne, her mother's distant cousin, who would in due course marry her mother in 1798 to give the child a name and a roof, wrote the long French entry into the parish register in his own careful hand. Marianne Waverley died of consumption in the cold spring of 1807, when Aurélie was 14. The old Reverend held the household together until 1813. He died on a wet February evening with a single quiet letter, sealed for his housekeeper friend, Mrs. Whittaker at Raysbury Hall, asking her, upon a point of Yorkshire honour and out of regard for the mother she had once known as a young still-room maid in the Waverley household, to take the girl in and keep her. So, in the summer of 1813, a slight 20-year-old gentlewoman with no English name worth honouring had come up through the kitchen yard of Raysbury Hall under the borrowed and serviceable name of Annie Cross, and had taken her place quietly as a general girl at £8 a year, and had been waiting, with the patience of a woman who has nothing further life can take from her, for the next instruction the world cared to offer. She was fluent in French. It had been her first language until she was 3, and her mother's choice of her education to her dying day. And she was fluent in Italian, and she read sufficient Latin for the office, and she had had Racine and Molière and Madame de Sévigné by heart since she was 17, and she could play a serviceable harp, and she could shell peas. She had not, in 2 years at Raysbury, chosen to make any of this visible. Mrs. Whittaker knew. Mrs. Whittaker, in black bombazine and silver chatelaine, had known her since the day she was carried up to the parsonage in her mother's arms, and kept her secret upon a point of honour. Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt knew none of this. He had spent 12 years in his uniform, Vimeiro and Vittoria, Toulouse and Quatre Bras, and Waterloo at the last, and he had sold out in the first week of September. He had been 3 weeks in London at his lodgings, sorting the larger and stranger affairs of an unexpected dukedom, when the news of his second cousin's hunting accident in the August had at last reached him properly through the family solicitors. The cousin, a heavy, careful man of 58, had left no son, and the title and the 12,000 acres had moved sideways in the family by 3 removes and lodged, in the closing days of the campaign, upon the only Stanhope still in regimentals. Thomas had not been to Raysbury Hall in 11 years. He had been 22 on the last visit. He was coming back now, on his own horse in driving rain, sold out and in mufti, because he was, by long campaigning habit, a man who preferred to go at a thing alone and to know the lie of his own ground before any other man told him what he saw. He came up the long avenue of bare oaks at 6 in the evening, and the lit windows of Raysbury Hall stood out yellow and warm against the wet pewter sky. He gave the bay over at the stable yard to a startled groom who did not know him. He came round to the side door because his boots were heavy with mud, and because the front hall at 6 in the evening of an unannounced Tuesday would have been a fuss. The side door was on the latch. The servants' hall beyond it was empty. A single tallow candle burned upon the long deal table. The fire was low. He crossed the flagged passage in his mud-spattered black top boots and his buff buckskin breeches and the wet-caped greatcoat, his plain leather riding glove in one hand and his dark brown beaver hat in the other, his white cravat tied in haste at the throat, and his cavalry tailcoat dark and unrelieved beneath. The smell of onions and damp stone met him at the kitchen door. She was alone at the long pine table. She did not start. She set down her knife with the unhurried composure of a well-trained kitchen maid, and she dropped a small curtsy with her eyes lowered to the board, and she waited. The cap was straight upon her chestnut hair. The wisp at the temple did not move. He took her in at a single tired soldier's glance. A slight young woman in a plain working dress and a white apron and a working cap, hands a little red from the cold scullery water of the morning. And he set her down in his own mind, without further consideration, as the undercook's assistant on her late evening at the chopping board. He spoke to her with the brevity of a wet and hungry man. "Cold meat," he said, "bread, a tankard of ale, if there is one drawn. I shall sit by your fire a quarter of an hour, my girl, while you fetch it. You may take this to dry." He pulled the heavy-caped greatcoat off his shoulders as he spoke, and held it out across his arm. She came round the table without speaking, and took it from him in both hands. It was sodden. She crossed to the kitchen fire and laid it across the back of the long settle, where the heat of the range would reach it. She set the beaver hat on the dresser. She lifted the iron tankard down from its hook and drew the ale herself, fresh from the cask in the cool larder. She fetched a plate of cold sliced ham and a half-loaf of fresh bread and a small dish of pickled walnuts. She set them before him at the table, with her eyes lowered to the wood. She did not speak. She did not ask his name. He did not give it. It would not have occurred to him, on a Tuesday evening in his own kitchen, to give a quiet, sensible kitchen maid an account of himself, and it would not that night have occurred to her to ask. He ate quickly, in the clean, unfussy fashion of a soldier who had eaten worse food in worse weather. She returned to her board and her onions and her knife. The candle burned between them. The kitchen was warm and very still. After some minutes he set down the tankard and observed, quietly, more to the room than to her, that she had a sensible hand at a kitchen table, and that he was obliged to her for the supper. She inclined her head a quarter of an inch, and went on with her chopping. Her smoke-grey eyes did not lift. It was Mr. Forsyth, the steward, 54, square-built, iron-grey-cropped, an honest Yorkshire face with a faint scar at the chin from a horse's kick in 1801, who was at last fetched from his off-evening rounds in the home farm, and came in upon them at 6:20, with his hat still in his hand and the rein still on his shoulders. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He took in the soldier at the long table. He took in the slight figure at the chopping board. He went, at once, and very white, into a long stream of profuse and proper apologies. Thomas heard him out without rising. He inquired after his chamber. He inquired after the housekeeper. He observed, with the same quiet brevity, that the kitchen girl had done him very well, and that he wished her no further trouble at this hour. He set down the tankard. He took up his beaver hat. He followed Mr. Forsyth out of the kitchen and along the back passage toward the principal stair. The slight young woman at the chopping board did not look up. She set her knife back to the onions. The wisp at her temple still did not move. Thomas was shown to the principal east bedchamber. A fire was kindled. A nightshirt was found. He slept badly, the way a man sleeps in an unfamiliar bed in a house in which he was last 22, and is now, in some sense, the master. And he was up at 6 in the morning at the bedchamber window, looking out upon the wet park and the shoulder of the moor beyond. On Wednesday morning at 11, he met the heads of household in the small saloon. Mr. Forsyth presented them in proper order. Mrs. Eleanor Whittaker, the housekeeper, 56, iron-grey hair pinned in a neat low bun, beneath a starched white linen cap with a narrow lace edge, warm, pale blue eyes, a kind round Yorkshire weathered face, 5 feet 2 and stout, in her black bombazine and white linen apron with the heavy bunch of keys upon a silver chatelaine at her waist, and a grey wool shawl over the bombazine against the corridors. The head groom, lean and weathered, in a brown wool coat. The head gardener, broad and silver-haired, a clerk from the estate office. The chaplain was at York. Thomas spoke briefly and properly to each. He thanked them. He asked them to continue for the present, in their own offices and at their own hours, and to bring to Mr. Forsyth any matter upon which his settled view was wanted. Aurélie was not in the line. He did not see her on Wednesday at all. On Thursday, he rode round half the home farms with Mr. Forsyth in his dark blue cavalry coat under a borrowed country waterproof, the iron-cold November eve wind coming up off the dale. He looked at fences and at gates and at the hill pasture and at 3 tenant families. He came back at dusk. He dined alone in the small dining room with 3 letters of business upon the cloth beside his plate. He retired at 10. He still did not see her. Friday morning was clearer. A high, pale blue Yorkshire sky. The rain at last gone off the wind, the wet bare oaks along the avenue dripping silver in a low sun. At 10:30, Thomas walked alone along the long oak corridor of the Palladian wing toward the long library at the west end. He was in his country dress now, a plain dark blue morning coat, a buff waistcoat with small horn buttons, buff breeches, well-polished brown-topped boots of soft leather, a white cravat properly tied, the heavy gold Ravenscourt ducal signet ring, a stooping falcon over a chevron on his right hand. He went alone because he was looking particularly for his late cousin's old hunting journals, a calf-bound run of them, by the cousin's own account, kept upon the lower shelf of the long library at the south end. The library was supposed to be empty at 10:30 on a Friday morning. He laid his hand upon the brass doorknob and turned it quietly. The voice came from the far end of the room. It came from the long, velvet-curtained window seat behind the tall reading screen at the south wall, a quiet, unhurried voice, reading half to itself in the cadence of a woman, reading a favourite passage aloud for company. And the language of the voice was French, flawless Parisian French, the vowels round and clear, the rhythm absolutely native, the consonants light upon the lip, and the speech was Phèdre's, from Racine. Le voici. Vers mon cœur tout mon sang se retire. J'oublie, en le voyant, ce que je viens lui dire. Mon âme chez les morts descendra la première. Je l'ai trop offensé pour en attendre lumière. Thomas stood with one hand still upon the brass knob of the door. He did not move. He listened. The voice went on for 4 lines more in the same unhurried cadence, accent perfect, breath deliberate, and then trailed off into a small companionable silence and the faint scrape of a needle going back through linen. He came round the reading screen. She was sitting in the long velvet-curtained window seat, with the cold, pale blue Yorkshire light upon her shoulder. She was in the same plain, coarse linen kitchen dress and the same coarse white apron of the Tuesday night. The plain white linen cap was still straight upon the dark chestnut-brown working knot. Her sewing, a small pile of household mending, lay folded in her lap. A small leather-bound volume of Racine lay open on the cushion beside her thigh. Her ivory pale face was lifted toward him without surprise, the small natural beauty mark high on the right cheekbone catching the light. Her clear smoke-grey eyes were composed and unfrightened, and for the first time since he had been in the house, looking at him directly. She did not stand up. She did not curtsy. She said in the same quiet, flawless Parisian French in which she had been reading, "Pardonnez-moi, Monsieur le Duc. Je n'ai pas voulu vous déranger." And then, in clear, quiet, educated English with the smallest North Yorkshire softening of the vowels, "It would, however, be best, Your Grace, if we did not inform Mrs. Whittaker of this. She does not know I borrow the books. I shall undertake to set Phèdre back upon her shelf within the hour." He did not answer her at once. He stood very still in the cold, pale light from the leaded window, and he looked at her for what was, by the long case clock at the south end of the library, a full 30 seconds. He did not move his hand from his side. The lock of dark chestnut hair that fell across his brow when he was at work fell now. Behind him, faintly, a coal settled in the library grate. He took, in those 30 seconds, a slow, private, and rather thorough accounting of every assumption he had carried up the long avenue of bare oaks in the rain on the Tuesday, and of the kitchen girl at the chopping board, and of the cold ham and the pickled walnuts and the wet-caped greatcoat handed across her arm to the kitchen fire, and at the end of the 30 seconds, in the dry, plain voice of a man not given to soft speeches, he made his apology. "I have made a very foolish mistake about you, miss. I should be obliged for your name, properly given." She did not answer at once. She set her sewing a little aside upon the cushion. She closed the volume of Racine over its ribbon with one finger to mark the place, and she folded her hands in her lap upon the coarse white apron, and she looked at him with the same composed, unfrightened, smoke-grey gaze. And after a small, still moment, she said, in her clear, quiet English, "Your Grace, my given name is Aurélie. I have lived as Annie Cross for 2 years at Wraysbury. The longer name I will tell you, if you wish it, when we are not in your library at 10:30 with a Racine open upon the cushion and a basket of mending in my lap." He inclined his head. It was the bow of a soldier and not a courtier, a single grave inclination from the shoulder, but it was, of its kind, very thorough. He spoke once more in the same plain, unhurried voice. "Mademoiselle Aurélie, I shall ask you the longer name another evening, at your own time and not before. May I, in the meanwhile, ask Mrs. Whittaker to relieve you of every kitchen duty until you and I have spoken again upon your situation? I shall not ask Mrs. Whittaker to do anything with which you do not first agree." She lifted her chin 1/4 of an inch. The wisp at her temple still did not move. "Your Grace, you may. I should be obliged." He bowed once more, a shade more briefly, and he stepped back from the window seat and gave her the room. He did not look for the hunting journals. He did not, in truth, recall, for 1/4 of an hour together, what he had come into the library for. He went out by the long oak corridor, and back along the Palladian wing toward his own study, and he closed his study door upon himself, and he stood for a long minute at his own window, looking out at the dripping oaks and the clearing sky. Aurélie sat for one further minute in the window seat. Then she rose. She gathered her small pile of mending into the woven sewing basket at her feet. She closed the volume of Racine and laid it in her left hand against the basket's rim. She straightened her plain white linen cap with the unhurried fingers of a woman who has dressed her own hair every morning of her life. She crossed the long library toward the door. She walked back along the long oak corridor of the Palladian wing, toward the back stairs at her own pace, the woven sewing basket upon her arm, the small leather-bound volume of Racine in her other hand, the white linen cap straight upon her dark chestnut hair, the small wisp at her temple where it had been since 6 o'clock that morning, and her clear, smoke-grey eyes, very steady and very clear. Saturday came up clear and cold over the dale, a thin frost upon the south lawn. At 9:45, the housekeeper's bell rang, and Mrs. Eleanor Whittaker, 56, iron-grey hair pinned in a low bun beneath a starched white linen cap with narrow lace edging, warm, pale blue eyes, a kind, round, Yorkshire-weathered face, 5'2" and stout in her black bombazine and white linen apron, the heavy bunch of keys upon her silver chatelaine chiming at her waist, took up her grey wool shawl, and walked the Palladian wing toward his Grace's study. She tapped once. She went in. Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt rose from behind the mahogany writing table at the south window in plain country dress, dark blue morning coat, buff waistcoat, buff breeches, brown-topped boots, white cravat, the heavy gold Ravenscourt signet upon his right hand. The lock of dark chestnut hair fell across his brow. His dark, hazel-green eyes were steady. He gestured her to the leather chair, and she took it with the composure of a woman who had been called into a master's study 50 times in 38 years. He did not waste her morning. "Mrs. Whittaker." I have spoken with Miss Cross in the library yesterday morning. I gather she is not Miss Cross. I gather she has been at Wraysbury 2 years upon your private kindness. I do not require a defence of you. I see you have acted as a Yorkshire woman acts. I require only your view. Should I now treat her as a gentlewoman? And is there any other person living to whom this matter is properly known? Mrs. Whittaker folded her hands upon her bombazine lap and met his eye. There was no flutter in her warm, pale blue gaze. She had been waiting, in some part of herself, for this conversation since 1813, when the black-edged letter from the dying Reverend Philip Hawthorne had been put into her hand. She told him the whole. She told him, first, of the late Reverend Philip Hawthorne, a country scholar who had taken in a young Frenchwoman in the 8th month of her widowhood in 1793, married her in 1798 to give her child a name and a roof, buried her of consumption in 1807, and kept the child until his own death in 1813. The old Reverend had sent her, a fortnight before he died, a letter asking her, out of regard for the mother she had once known as a still-room maid at Settle, to take the girl in, call her Annie Cross, and keep her until the world should turn its face her way again. She told him, then, of Marianne Waverley, whom she had known as a girl of 17 in 1785, had gone to Picardy in 1788, and married there in May of 1789 the young Comte Henri Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, a moderate man with a small estate, 100 acres of vineyard, a careful regard for his tenants. There had been, in those 5 years, the small business of a revolution. She named here what she would name, and not more. The Comte had been a Girondin, and had refused to leave France for the émigré armies. On the 17th of August in 1793, in Paris, his execution had been carried out. Marianne, 8 months gone with child, was brought out by way of Hamburg, by her father's old land agent, with the Comte's old French nurse, Madame Renée Vautrin, at her side. They reached the parsonage in the wet October of that year. On the 15th of November, the child was delivered and christened by the Reverend Philip, with the long French name in the register. She told him, last, of Madame Vautrin, 71 now, widowed of a Yorkshire blacksmith, living alone at the bottom of the village. She had kept, since 1793, a small enamelled steel jewel case containing the rest of Mademoiselle's mother and father. It had stood 22 years upon her mantelpiece. Mademoiselle had never asked for it. Madame Vautrin had never opened it to her. They had been waiting. "It would be no hard thing, Your Grace," Mrs. Whittaker said quietly, "to send the carriage down for Madame Vautrin and have her bring it up. She has been waiting for the day." When she had done, Thomas asked the second of his questions. "Is there any other person living to whom this matter is properly known?" "The present Reverend James Hawthorne," she said. "His father told him before he died. The Reverend has the parish register, a sealed packet of letters from her dying mother, and the original St. Vrain papers his father kept for her. He will be very glad when he sees her come down the Lichgate path on Sunday." "There is no other, Your Grace?" Thomas asked her then the question he had brought her in for. "Mrs. Whittaker, your settled view?" The housekeeper did not hesitate. "Yes, Your Grace. She is a gentlewoman, and ought to be treated so. I have known her since the day she was carried to the parsonage in her mother's arms, and she has been a gentlewoman every minute of the 22 years." Thomas inclined his head. He thanked her. He asked her to have the blue guest chamber on the principal floor made ready by 3 that afternoon, to move Mademoiselle's small box up herself, and to inform Mademoiselle that the move was made upon his own instruction and not to be debated. He asked her to send the carriage down to Madame Vautrin's cottage on the Tuesday. Mrs. Whittaker rose, dropped a small, composed curtsy of the older Yorkshire kind, and went out at her brisk, practical step. By 3, the blue guest chamber was ready. Southeast corner of the Palladian wing, 2 tall sashed windows upon the slow bend of the wharf and the long shoulder of the moor beyond, walls hung in pale Wedgwood blue, plain blue wool bed curtains, a fire of dry oak in the grate. 2 housemaids carried up Aurélie's small wooden box, 3 printed cotton dresses, 4 linen aprons, a hairbrush, a small mirror, a Latin gospel, a small French racine, a wooden cross on a black silk cord, and a brown paper packet of letters from her late guardian stepfather, tied in faded green ribbon. Aurélie did not protest. She came up the principal stair behind Mrs. Whittaker in her kitchen dress and white apron and cap, and stood a quarter of an hour while the maid set her box upon the blanket chest. She thanked them. When they had gone, she sat in the chair in the south window and looked out at the moor for 1 full hour without moving. A solitary kestrel hung above the high field beyond the wharf. A faint plume of peat smoke rose from a shepherd's cot a long way off. Aurélie did not weep. After the hour she rose, washed at the washstand, took off the kitchen cap, drew her long dark chestnut hair from the working knot, and brushed it from crown to ends. She coiled it in a smooth chignon at the nape, the small wisps loose at the temples. She put the small jet cross at her throat. That evening at 6, Thomas sent Mr. Forsyth down for her. She came along the corridor in the kitchen dress and white apron, the chignon smooth, the small jet cross at her throat, and stopped at the door of the small library. 2 beeswax candles burned in silver candlesticks. Thomas stood at the writing table in dark green country coat and white cravat, the signet upon his hand. Mr. Forsyth, 54, iron grey close-cropped hair, square, honest, weathered face, a faint, pale scar at the chin from a horse's kick in 1801, dark brown wool country coat over buff waistcoat and brown cord breeches, stood at a side table with the ledger open and a fresh quill across the page. Aurélie understood at once that he had been called as a witness and was grateful for the precaution. She inclined her head. He returned the bow with quiet brevity. She sat in the chair, Thomas indicated by the fire. Thomas spoke plainly. "Mademoiselle, I have this morning satisfied myself, upon the testimony of Mrs. Whittaker, of the larger part of your situation. I propose this evening 3 things, in the presence of Mr. Forsyth, so that there shall be no later misunderstanding. First, I shall write tomorrow morning to a London firm, Hookham and Thornton of Lincoln's Inn, who have made their business the recovery of French property under the Bourbon Restoration, and instruct them to inquire upon your behalf into whatever may remain of your father's estate at Saint-Vrain. Second, this undertaking is unconditional. It is not contingent upon your remaining at Wraysbury upon any terms whatever. Should you at any future date remove yourself from this house, the inquiry shall continue upon my private account until concluded. Third, I require of you, in return, only a single sealed deposition in your own hand, drawn by Mr. Forsyth, and witnessed by the Reverend Hawthorne, of your parents' names, the date of your birth, and your godparents, in so far as you know them. Nothing further." He stopped. He looked at her steadily across the firelight. Aurélie sat a long, quiet moment, with her hands folded upon her white apron. Then she lifted her smoke-grey eyes to Thomas's face, and answered him in the careful, even cadence she had been preparing, all unaware, for a great part of 12 years. "Your Grace, you have done me, in 2 days, what I had not in 12 years, the courage to ask any English gentleman to consider doing for me. I shall give you the deposition by Tuesday. I ask in return only that whatever is recovered, if anything is recovered, shall be at my own disposal, subject to my mother's small Yorkshire annuity, which I shall settle upon Mrs. Whittaker, and to a £30 annuity I shall settle upon Madame Vautrin. The rest I shall consider when it is in my hand." Thomas inclined his head, very gravely. "Mademoiselle, I would not have thought of asking you for any other arrangement, Mr. Forsyth dipped his quill and wrote 3 lines into the ledger in his clear estate clerk's hand. He bowed to Aurélie. She bowed to him. Thomas walked her to the library door, did not offer his arm, did not touch her, and bowed her out. Sunday came up cold and pale blue and clear. The bells of St. Cuthbert's began at 9:30. The slate-grey wool morning gown, high-waisted, long-sleeved, plain round neck, run up by Mrs. Whittaker in 3 days from a length of cloth she had kept in her iron-bound box since 1810, sat upon Aurélie as if cut for her in a London workroom. The white lawn fichu crossed at the throat. The small jet cross lay against the lawn. The dark chestnut hair, down at last from the working cap, was coiled in a smooth chignon at the nape, with the small wisps loose at the temples. The first time at Wraysbury. Plain black wool stockings, plain black leather slippers. Her smoke-grey eyes were very clear. They walked down the long avenue together at 10:05, the small Sunday flock of village folk falling back to either edge of the path. At the Lich Gate, Mrs. Whittaker offered her arm. Aurélie took it. They went up the worn stone path, between the cold winter graves, under the bare yews, through the Norman porch, into the body of the church. Every face turned. There was no rudeness in the turning. It was the slow, unforced regard of a country congregation seeing one of its own come back, after a long absence the parish had felt without naming. Aurélie did not look to either side. She walked down the aisle on Mrs. Whittaker's arm at her own pace, the chignon smooth, the small jet cross at her throat, her smoke-grey eyes upon the altar, and took the pew 3 rows from the front. In the chancel, the Reverend James Hawthorne, 31, soft, sandy brown hair neatly cut, clear, honest grey eyes, 6 feet tall and thin with the slight scholar's stoop, in his black clerical coat and white collar band, the small silver crucifix on the black silk cord at his breast, looked up from the prayer book and saw her. He turned his head once toward his sister Anna in the front pew, said nothing, and turned back to his book. The corner of his mouth, very briefly, eased. After the service, the congregation filed out under the cold, pale blue sky. The Reverend stood beneath the Lich Gate and gave each parishioner the same plain Yorkshire word. When Aurélie came under the shade of the Lich Gate upon Mrs. Whittaker's arm, he stepped aside with her, the housekeeper falling back 2 paces, and walked with Aurélie a short way down the path between the cold winter graves. He said in his quiet voice, "Welcome, Aurélie. My father said you would come back to your name when the time was ready. I shall be in my study from 3 to 7 each day this week, if you have any of his letters or papers you wish me to lay before you." She answered him with the same composure with which she had answered Thomas in the library on Friday. "I shall come, James. Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken his Christian name aloud. He inclined his sandy brown head and let her go on, and turned back to the next of his parishioners under the Lich Gate. Monday at Wraysbury was a long, quiet working day of a kind the hall had not seen in 11 years. In his study, Thomas wrote the long, careful letter to Hookham and Thornton of Lincoln's Inn, sealing it with the heavy gold signet of the stooping falcon. In the small saloon, Aurélie sat at the rosewood writing table by the south window in her slate-grey wool, drafting in her clear, even hand the deposition Mr. Forsyth had asked of her. The names of her father and mother, the dates of their marriage and her own birth, the parish of her christening, the godparents her mother had given her on her deathbed. Her hand did not shake. In the housekeeper's room, Mrs. Whittaker knelt at the open lid of her iron-bound box and turned over the folded packet she had kept since 1814. A black-edged letter from the dying Reverend Philip Hawthorne consigning Aurélie to her discretion, and laid it aside, broken seal upward, ready to her hand on the Tuesday. Tuesday was cold and clear and very still. The carriage was sent down at 3:30. A few minutes after 4, it returned. The small old woman who came down was Madame Renée Vautrin, 71, 5 feet tall, thin and brisk upon a plain ebony walking stick, soft white hair pinned in a low bun beneath a small white lace cap with narrow violet ribbon, sharp, warm, dark brown eyes that missed nothing, fair Picardy skin, gently lined, age-spotted on the backs of her hands, a small heart-shaped face with a small French scar at the chin, long-heeled, a fall in 1799. She wore a plain black bombazine widow's gown, white lawn fichu, a small jet cross on a black silk cord, a black wool shawl, and the thin gold wedding band she had not removed in 53 years. Beneath her left arm, she carried a flat parcel wrapped in green baize. Mrs. Whittaker took her into the housekeeper's parlour, a low, warm-panelled room with a bright fire of oak billet and a round oak table by the hearth. Aurélie was already there in the slate-grey wool, her chignon smooth. She rose when the old woman came in. Madame Vautrin laid her stick along a settle, crossed to her, took her face briefly between her 2 small, age-spotted hands, and looked into her smoke-grey eyes for a long moment without speaking. Then she let her go, took the parcel from under her arm, and set it upon the table. Within the worn green baize lay a small enamelled steel jewel case, 8 inches by 5, the enamel a faded blue, with a chaste pattern of vine leaves at the corners, brass hinges plain, a single brass clasp at the front. Madame Vautrin put her hand upon the lid for a moment, and drew a steady breath. She spoke first in her own French, quiet Picardy French, softened by 50 years of Yorkshire, and then, with the patient composure of a woman who had translated for her mistress for 30 years, repeated herself in slow English for Mrs. Whittaker. Mademoiselle, c'est ce que j'ai gardé quand nous sommes partis de Picardie. C'est le reste de votre mère et de votre père. Ce n'est pas beaucoup, mais c'est à vous. Mademoiselle, this is what I kept when we left Picardie. This is the rest of your mother and your father. It is not very much, but it is yours. Aurélie inclined her head and sat down on the high-backed settle nearest the table. Mrs. Whittaker took the further settle at a small remove. Madame Vautrin opened the brass clasp and lifted out the contents one at a time, in the order in which she had laid them in 22 years before, naming each as she set it upon the worn green baize. She lifted out, first, a small antique gold cross, perhaps an inch tall, round cut, plain, very old, the gold soft and warm in the firelight, on a fresh black silk cord. The cross of the late Comtesse Madeleine de Saint-Vrain, your father's mother. It had been her grandmother's. The Comtesse who did not survive the year of 93. The cross is yours. She lifted out, second, a small silver oval the size of a sovereign, and opened the tiny clasp. Within, upon a bed of dark blue silk, lay a lock of dark chestnut hair, tied with a thin silver thread. Your father's hair, cut for your mother in the spring of 93. She lifted out, third and fourth, 2 small miniatures in ivory ovals. The first, a young man of perhaps 25, dark chestnut hair brushed back from a high brow, grave hazel eyes, a cream and blue court coat. Your father, at 25, in court dress. The second, a slight young woman of perhaps 20, soft chestnut hair in a simple knot, clear smoke-grey eyes, very like Aurélie's own, a white muslin gown, a half-blown rose at the waist. Your mother, at 20, in white muslin with a single rose, painted at Saint-Vrain in the second year of their marriage. She lifted out, fifth, a flat packet of 3-folded letters tied with faded blue ribbon. 3 letters of their courtship, 88 to 89. Read them when you can. She lifted out, sixth, a single sheet of vellum, faintly yellowed, sealed with a plain wax seal of a stooping bird. The French parish hand of the curé of Saint-Vrain ran in even lines across the page, and Aurélie saw the long name of her own christening, Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, fille de Henri Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, comte de Saint-Vrain, et de Marianne Weverley son épouse, baptisée le 15e de novembre 1793 en l'église de Saint-Vrain. She lifted out, last, a small leather-bound book, black calf, worn smooth, a brass clasp at the foredge. The family Bible, in Latin, in your father's hand at the margins. A note upon the morning of your mother's wedding. A note on the morning he sent you both away. She closed the lid. The brass clasp gave a faint click. The fire spoke once. Madame Vautrin sat down upon the third settle with her stick across her lap, and did not speak again. Aurélie sat very still through the whole laying out. She had not lifted a finger to touch any of the objects. Her smoke-grey eyes had moved, in their unhurried way, from the cross to the silver oval, to the miniatures, to the courtship letters, to the vellum, to the Latin Bible, and they had not filled. When Madame Vautrin had laid her hand again upon her stick, Aurélie rose, crossed to her, lifted her right hand gently from the ebony, bent and kissed the age-spotted knuckles once, and laid the hand back upon the stick. Madame Vautrin closed her eyes a moment, opened them, and inclined her small white head. Aurélie turned to Mrs. Whittaker, gave her the same 1/4-inch incline of the chin she had given her under the lich gate on the Sunday, lifted the case in both her hands from the table, carried it out of the parlour at her own pace, went up the principal stair alone, along the corridor, into the blue guest chamber, and shut the door quietly behind her. She did not come down to dinner. At 9, Mrs. Whittaker took a tray up. Bread, cold chicken, a glass of small ale, a beeswax taper, set it upon the writing table without speaking, and went out without sound. At 11:30, the great house at last settling for the night, Aurélie sat in the southeast window of the blue guest chamber. The enamelled steel jewel case lay closed upon her lap. Her right hand rested flat upon its faded blue lid. Her left hand was upon the small jet cross at her throat. The beeswax taper burned at her elbow. Beyond the leaded panes, the first November Eve wind was coming up off the moor. A long, slow Yorkshire wind that smelled of wet heather and peat smoke and the cold wharf. The dark shoulder of the moor stood against a sky pricked with the first stars. Her smoke-grey eyes were wet now, at last, very steadily wet, and they did not waver, and they did not close, and they looked out across the dale toward the country in which she had lived for 22 years, under another woman's borrowed and serviceable name. The 12th of November, 1815 came in cold and clear over the high dale, a hard, early frost glazing the deer park grass to pale silver and the wharf running iron-dark below in the cut. Mrs. Whittaker had had the green dressing-room aired since Tuesday, a fresh fire laid in the saloon at 3, and the plain blue Wedgwood tea-things kept hot from 4:15 against the moment the carriage should be heard upon the gravel. Thomas's express had reached his sister in Hill Street, Mayfair, on the evening of the 8th. She had given orders to have her trunks ready by 5 upon the 9th, and taken the Edinburgh mail out of London at first light. 3 nights upon the Great North Road, a noon dinner at the Black Swan in York, where Mr. Forsyth had sent the Raisbury carriage to wait, and at 4 minutes before 5, upon the evening of the 12th, she rolled at last under the lich gate of the parish she had not seen in 18 years, and up the avenue of bare oaks toward the lit windows of Raysbury Hall. Aurelie was at the south window of the saloon in the slate-grey wool morning gown with the white lawn fichu and the small jet cross, her chestnut hair smooth in its low chignon. Thomas was at the long fire in dark green superfine, his back to the room. Mrs. Whittaker stood by the door. The clock chimed the 3/4. The door opened. Lady Margaret Stanhope came in. She was a slim woman of 38, 5'6", with the upright carriage of an earl's widow. She wore a high-waisted, lavender silk half-mourning gown, well cut, a white lace fichu at the throat, a small jet cross on a black silk cord, a small jet brooch at the bosom with a single lock of soft brown hair beneath the glass, her plain gold wedding band upon the third finger of her left hand. Her soft, chestnut-brown hair was pinned in a neat low coronet beneath a small grey lace widow's cap. Her oval face was fair and finely lined with healthy English colour high upon the cheekbones, the family resemblance to Thomas Plain at the brow and mouth. Her shrewd, warm hazel eyes, very like her brother's, with long laughter lines fanning at the outer corners, took in the room, the fire, the brother at the fire, the housekeeper at the door, and last, deliberately, the slight young woman composed at the south window. In the space of 15 seconds, she set her pelisse down upon the settle, crossed directly to Aurelie, took her by both shoulders, and kissed her once upon each cheek. Mademoiselle de Saint-Vrain. Forgive me. My brother's letter has had me on the road for 3 days. I am glad to see you upon the principal floor, where you ought always to have been. We shall have a great deal to do together this winter, and I shall expect a French lesson each morning at 10. My French has gone shockingly to the dogs since I left Switzerland in 1797. Aurelie did not speak. She closed her eyes briefly, drew one short, steady breath, and the tears came, silent, no movement in her shoulders, no sound, and stood upon her lashes for the count of perhaps 10 seconds, and were checked, and were dabbed once with the corner of the white lawn fichu, and were done. Lady Margaret, in the same 15 seconds, had turned her head and addressed a wholly inconsequential remark to the fire about the cold of the road from Boroughbridge, and had thereby seen nothing. Mrs. Whittaker by the door lowered her eyes to her keys, lifted them again, and went out for the tea. Thomas met his sister's hazel eyes, gave her the smallest possible inclination of the head, a brother's full thanks given inside half a second, and crossed to take her hand and lead her to the settle. Mrs. Whittaker brought in the tea. Lady Margaret poured Aurelie's cup first, with the small unspoken nicety of a duchess's paw. The 3 of them sat over the tea and the fire as the early November dark closed in, and the household at Raysbury, for the first time in 3 years, held a complete and decent number of women upon its principal floor at 5 o'clock. Through the days that followed, Lady Margaret took Aurelie quietly in hand. She did not propose mourning. Aurelie, she observed to her brother over the port, had no recent dead, her father gone 22 years, her mother 8, her stepfather 2. And to put her into crape now would be to make a costume of a grief long since a settled habit of the heart. What she required was a wardrobe befitting a gentlewoman of 22 in a Yorkshire country house in winter, and a quiet plan for her gradual reintroduction to county society at Christmas. She wrote the same morning to her milliner in York and to Madame Lefebvre's in Stonegate, requesting that the first parcels be sent up by York carrier on the 19th. On the morning of the 19th, exactly as appointed, the covered cart came up the avenue at noon. The gowns were 4. The slate-grey wool Aurelie already had, a darker dove-grey wool of the same cut for every day, a soft cornflower blue silk evening gown with short puff sleeves and white lace at the hem, and a high-waisted cream wool for special occasions. With them came kid gloves, black silk slippers, leather house shoes, warm wool stockings, a quilted petticoat, a fresh white lawn fichu, and a pair of short, pearl-drop earrings, Lady Margaret's own. The writing desk was a neat, sloping-top mahogany lap desk with brass corners, brass inkwells, laid paper, quills, sealing wax, and a plain brass seal cut with the single letter A in a Roman hand. Aurélie laid her hand upon the polished lid for the count of 3. She thanked Lady Margaret once, very plainly. Lady Margaret kissed her on the brow, as though she had been Maria, and went down to her own letters. Late in November, Mr. Forsyth set out for London upon Thomas's express, carrying Aurélie's deposition, the certified Picardy baptismal certificate, Madame Vautrin's signed statement, the courtship letters, the 1789 marriage settlement, and Thomas's covering letter to Hookham and Thornton at Lincoln's Inn. He sat the Thursday and the Friday in Mr. Thornton's chambers, going through the Bourbon period restoration schedules, and came up north again upon the Tuesday following. He came into Thomas's study at 4 upon the afternoon of the 2nd of December. The Saint-Vrain estate, he said, had been restored by the Bourbons in 1814 to the surviving heirs of Henri Lacroix de Saint-Vrain. The chateau itself was in ruin, the west wing fallen in, the east wing standing. About 100 acres of vineyard remained, neglected but recoverable upon 2 seasons of husbandry. There was further an annuity of 4,000 livres upon the Paris bonds, the arrears since 1814 standing already to the credit of the heir at the receiver's office in Amiens. The total would yield, by Mr. Hookham's careful estimate, about £400 sterling a year, plus the property once the title was confirmed. Hookham and Thornton could lodge the claim with the French Royal Commission within 6 weeks. Counsel gave a strong probable opinion of success. The probable timeline was 2 years. Aurélie was sent for. She came in her dove grey wool, her hands folded, and listened with composure as Mr. Forsyth went through the news at his measured Yorkshire pace. She did not flinch at the word ruin, nor smile at the word annuity, nor change her colour at £400. When he had finished, she looked a moment toward the leaded window, where the first thin snowflake of the season was lifting along the panes, turned to Thomas and said, "Your Grace, I thank you. I shall sign whatever Mr. Forsyth requires, in front of him, this afternoon, and again as often as the Commission shall ask." She signed 3 affidavits within the half-hour in her clear, even hand. Aurélie Madeleine, Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain. Mr. Forsyth witnessed each. The papers were sealed in the safe. Aurélie went back to the saloon and took up her sewing. December at Raysbury settled into its small, steady habits. After breakfast, Aurélie read for an hour in the long library by the south window. Madame de Sévigné, Cowper, Bossuet, in the seat where Thomas had first heard her. After the library, she walked with Lady Margaret in the Deer Park in the hooded cream cashmere cloak, the 2 of them under the bare oaks, French at first and English at the last. Twice a week, they paid Madame Vautrin in her stone cottage with a bundle of linen and good raspberry tea. The old nurse poured them out of her French copper pot, her sharp, warm, dark brown eyes following Aurélie about the whitewashed room with quiet pride. On 3 afternoons of the 2nd week, Aurélie took up at last in Reverend James Hawthorne's study the long-deferred parish accounts of his late father. 5 years of ledgers, parish poor relief, the Christmas dole, the schoolhouse stipend, the wood money for the widow Penketh's coals in 1810. She and the young vicar sat opposite at his oak table, Aurélie reading out the figures and the Reverend James writing them clean into a fresh ledger. They finished on the 3rd afternoon, signed each volume at the foot, and the Reverend laid the new ledgers on his shelf with the visible pleasure of a man who has lifted a debt of duty. By mid-December, Thomas had begun to ride out with her upon the high country. He had bought from Mr. Travers's stable in Skipton a quiet bay mare of 14 1/2 hands with a willing temper, and called her Coquette. He put Aurelie up in the home park first, twice round the upper paddock with a leading rein, the third time without. And by the third day, she had her seat as cleanly as her mother had given it her at 12 years old in the parsonage paddock. By the third week, they went up the drove road to the high moor, and stood Coquette and Thomas's grey hunter Marston side by side upon the shoulder, and looked east toward the pale silver line of the German Ocean, and west toward the blue ridges of Wensleydale, and said very little. Thomas, in the first week of December, finished a long-deferred letter to Major Charles Pemberton of Penrith, an old Cumberland friend, who had asked him in October whether he would be returning to London for the season. He wrote, among the estate paragraphs concerning the price of black-faced weather mutton and the dredging of the lower wharf, a single quiet line. I am at Wraysbury now, and likely to remain. I find the country quieter than London, but considerably better educated. He blotted, sealed, and laid it in the post-bag without further comment. Christmas Eve fell upon a Sunday, a fine, dry, crisp morning, and no fresh fall of snow upon the dale, though the high places north of the moor stood white. Mrs. Whittaker had had the great hall decked at noon with holly and ivy, and a great branch of yew upon the high mantel. At 5:45, the house party set out for St. Cuthbert's by foot, the church being but a gentle quarter of a mile down the avenue and across the small stone bridge, Thomas and Mr. Forsyth walking ahead, Lady Margaret with her arm through Aurelie's, Mrs. Whittaker in plain black silk Sunday best at Aurelie's other side, the under-footmen with the lanterns in the rear. The bells began at 6. Aurelie wore the cream-wool gown with the white lawn fichu and the small jet cross at her throat, and a small fresh posy of holly and ivy at her waist where Mrs. Whittaker had pinned it half an hour before. Her chestnut hair was smooth in its low chignon. The cold of the dale was a faint pink upon her cheekbones. Her hands were folded inside the warm cream cashmere cloak. She walked between Lady Margaret and Mrs. Whittaker down the Lichgate path with the slow, even pace of a woman who has come at last into the place she was always meant to come into, and the village, drawn up in its Sunday best on either side, watched her come without speaking, and the bells rang on overhead. The whole village was in the church. The pews were full from the gallery to the chancel. The Wraysbury pew upon the north side of the aisle, with its pale oak panelling and its carved shield of the falcon and chevron, had been kept open. Mr. Forsyth handed Lady Margaret in first, then Aurelie, then Mrs. Whittaker, then Thomas. Reverend James Hawthorne, in his white linen surplice over his black cassock, stood upon the chancel step and gave out the first hymn. The Yorkshire choir of 8 in the gallery sang it through with the plain, unhurried steadiness that an old North Country parish gives a Christmas Eve hymn. The candles burned even upon the altar. After the second collect, the Reverend gave the parish notice for the Christmas Day collection for the parish poor. He paused, looked up over his prayer book, set both his hands flat upon the lectern, and said, in his quiet, honest voice that carried clean to the gallery without his raising it, "And the Lord hath also brought us a daughter of this parish home, and she sits this evening in our pew, where she ought always to have sat. I shall not name her. The parish knows her. We shall give thanks for her, and proceed to our prayers." The whole congregation, by some quiet joint Yorkshire instinct, said amen with a low warmth that surprised even Lady Margaret in the Wraysbury pew, who lifted her chin 1/4 of an inch to settle it, and then sat very still. Aurelie did not cry. She lifted her chin 1/4 of an inch in her turn. She turned the page of the prayer book before her, and she found the next collect, and she waited steadily upon the Reverend's voice. The service went on. Louise. The Reverend gave the second hymn. The candles burned even. The service closed at 7:30. The older men touched their forelocks at the Wraysbury pew. The older women dipped a small Yorkshire curtsy at Lady Margaret and Aurelie equally. Aurelie came down the lich gate path, with the jet cross steady in the lantern light and the holly and ivy posy a little crushed from the pew. The carriage stood at the gate. A horse stood tied to the rail beyond. A florid gentleman of nearer 50 than 40 stepped out from beside the porch, soft, of medium height, thinning iron-grey hair combed forward in a Brutus, small, shallow, pale blue eyes set rather close, a florid complexion threaded with broken veins across the nose, a weak, narrow chin, in a dark claret tailcoat with gilt buttons over a primrose yellow silk waistcoat, buff pantaloons, top boots with silver tassels, a heavy gold watch chain with 3 carnelian seals, a quizzing glass on a black ribbon. Sir Edward Granville, of Granville Priory, 12 miles east, who had ridden over for the service. He stared at Aurelie with the small, fixed half-smile of a man recognizing a likeness, stepped forward and made her a small, officious bow. Lady Margaret was there before he had straightened. She came down the path between Aurelie and the gate without altering her pace, gave him the smallest possible inclination of the head, and said in her clear, cool drawing-room voice, "Sir Edward, the carriage waits. Please excuse us." She handed Aurelie up into the raspberry carriage with her own gloved hand and followed her in. Thomas, a step behind, bowed once to Sir Edward with the smallest possible inclination, the bow with which a regimental officer dismisses an inferior, and rode beside the carriage up the avenue. The great door of Raysbury shut behind them at 20 minutes to 8. Christmas Day was kept, by Lady Margaret's quiet direction, as a small private dinner. The small green dining room was laid for 6 at 1 o'clock, the round mahogany table set with plain plate and a centrepiece of holly and ivy. Thomas at the head, Lady Margaret at his right, Madame Vautrin, brought up from the village at 12:30 in her best black bombazine with the white lace cap with violet ribbon, a small jet cross at her throat, her ebony stick at her chair, at his left in the place of honour. Aurelie at the foot, Reverend Hawthorne at Lady Margaret's right, Mr. Forsyth at Madame Vautrin's left. The first remove a clear soup of the home farm, the second a sirloin of beef with horseradish and winter greens, the third the plum pudding brought in flaming with a sprig of holly on the top, hot mulled claret in the small silver jug. Lady Margaret carved. Thomas listened. Madame Vautrin, between the second and third remove, told 3 small affectionate stories of Aurelie's mother as a girl in Picardy in the spring of 1791, in halting English with the occasional French phrase. Lady Margaret turned quietly a beat later. She told first of the day Marianne Waverley, then a slim English girl of 23 engaged to be married, had gone down with the curé to take soup to the wife of the village wheelwright, brought to bed of twins. The wheelwright's wife had set her to washing the older child, and Marianne had washed and dressed her, and the child had fallen asleep upon the new mistress's shoulder for a full hour. She told, second, of the day Marianne had asked the old cook at Saint-Vrain to teach her how an omelette was set. She had stood at the range in a white apron and broken the eggs herself, and had taken it up to her father-in-law, the old Comte, at his desk, and the old Comte had eaten every fold of it. She told, third, of an autumn evening Marianne had sat upon the step of the great south door at sunset, with the small chestnut puppy upon her lap, looking across the vines toward the red sun upon the wheat stubble, and had said in her plain English, "I shall teach my daughter Renée to sit just here and to look just so every autumn evening of her life." Madame Vautrin paused at the end, looking down at her glass. Aurélie laid her hand upon the old woman's and did not move it for the rest of the course. Thomas listened gravely and did not speak. After dinner, the party went through to the long saloon, where Mrs. Whittaker had lit the great fire and set out the harp by the south window. Aurélie had not sat to the harp in any house for 8 years, not since her mother's death in the summer of 1807, when she had been 14. Lady Margaret had sent the man up from York to tune it on the Friday. Aurélie crossed the carpet now in her cream wool gown, with the holly and ivy posy still pinned at the waist, sat upon the stool, ran her hand once down the strings, and played, very simply, the old French air her mother had taught her at 6 years old upon her grandfather's harp at the parsonage, Plaisir d'amour. She played it through twice, plainly, with no ornament, the second time a little slower than the first. Madame Vautrin closed her eyes for the length of the air. Her white head tipped against the wing of the chair. When the last note had gone, the old woman opened her eyes and said, in plain French, "C'était comme votre mère, ma petite." Exactement. Aurélie laid her hand flat upon the strings to still them, rose, crossed to her, and kissed her once upon the soft white hair beneath the lace cap with the violet ribbon. The party broke up at 10. Madame Vautrin was carried down to her cottage. The Reverend walked back to his vicarage. Lady Margaret kissed Aurélie at the foot of the principal stair and went up. Aurélie looked once at the fire in the long saloon, at the harp, at the empty chair where Madame Vautrin had sat, and went up the stair quietly to her own chamber. Thomas did not go up. He took a single candle into the long library and crossed to the south window. Snow had begun, while they were at the harp, to come down upon the deer park, fine, slow, silver in the dark, laying itself softly upon the bare oaks and upon the home farm slates beyond. He stood at the leaded panes with one hand upon the cold lead, the harp's last note still somewhere in the room behind him, and he thought, very plainly, in the dry interior voice of a man not given to interior speeches, that the kitchen maid in the wet October passage had become, in 8 weeks, the only person under his own roof he could imagine still being under his roof at 60. He stood another minute. The snow came down silver. He took up the candle and went up the stair. The first week of January, 1816, came down upon Wraysbury in a Yorkshire silence so cold it had a colour. The colour was white at the high places, where the snow had laid itself in slow drifts upon the lip of the moor, iron in the dale, where the wharf ran black and thin between its frost-edged banks, and silver upon the deer park, where the hard frost held the bare oaks of the long avenue in its still grip. The home farm chimneys put up their thin, straight columns of smoke into a sky of pale, unbroken grey. The bells of St. Cuthbert's, when they rang for matins on the first Sunday of the new year, sounded thin and far over the dale, as though the cold itself had pulled them taut. In the small front rooms of the hall, the fires were never let down. Mrs. Whittaker had given orders that the great hall fire, and the saloon fire, and the library fire, and the fires of the blue guest chamber should be made up at 6:30 each morning, and not fall below a steady red until 11 at night. Aurélie, in her plain slate-grey wool, walked the long gallery each morning, between breakfast and her French lesson with Lady Margaret, hands folded at her waist, the small jet cross steady at her throat. Thomas, in his dark green country coat and his brown-topped boots, rode out daily with Mr. Forsyth upon the home farms, and came back at dusk with the fine cold colour high in his cheeks and his greatcoat speckled with frost. It was upon this still bright cold of the new year that the carriage of Lady Cassandra Ferrars turned, on the afternoon of the 8th of January, in at the lodge gates of Wraysbury Hall, uninvited but expected. Lady Margaret had been forewarned 3 days before by a careful little note from a Bath friend, folded square. "Cassandra is for Wraysbury on the 8th, my dear, with poor Gertrude in tow. She has heard of your French guest. I thought you should know." Margaret had read it twice, set it upon the fire, and gone to find Aurélie. "My dear," she had said, sitting down beside her at the small writing desk. A Lady Cassandra Ferrers proposes herself for tea on Tuesday. She is 25, an heiress, conventionally beautiful, and has considered herself the next Duchess of Ravenscourt since August. Her aunt will come with her. We shall give them tea in the pale green saloon at 3. You will wear precisely what you are wearing now. You will speak only when you wish to speak. You will leave the field, my dear, to me. Aurélie had inclined her head. Madame, I shall. The carriage at the door at 3 was a smart town landau quite unsuited to the Yorkshire roads, with 2 grooms in claret and silver livery, and a pair of matched bays steaming in the cold. Lady Cassandra came up the great steps first, her gown of deep rose silk catching the pale winter light at every fold, her white kid gloves drawn smooth above her elbows, her spangled gold gauze fan held closed against her wrist, the parure of pearls and small rubies at her throat and in her ears. The Greek coronet of 3 thin pearl ropes was set high upon her glossy chestnut hair. Her practised long lashes lifted in an unhurried, heavy-lidded glance at the great hall as she came in. Behind her, Lady Gertrude Ferrers, 50 and faded blonde and dressed in plain grey silk with a cream lace collar, came up the steps with the quieter step of a woman who had been a chaperone for half her life. In the pale green saloon the fire was high. Mrs. Whittaker had set out the small Sèvres tea service upon the rosewood table, the seed cake upon a glass stand, the muffins beneath their silver dome. Lady Margaret, in her lavender silk, half mourning with the white lace fichu and the small jet cross, rose from the sofa to greet her guests with the unhurried kindness of an earl's widow who had received 1,000 calls in 20 years. Aurélie rose more quietly from the chair at Margaret's right hand, and the slate-grey wool of her gown made the briefest cool flat note against the deep rose silk that came in at the door. Lady Cassandra, Lady Gertrude, how kind of you to brave our Yorkshire weather. Come to the fire. May I present Mademoiselle Aurélie Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, who has been with us at Wraysbury since the autumn. Lady Cassandra cocked her chin a quarter inch and let her heavy-lidded gaze slide over Aurélie from the smooth chestnut chignon at the nape, down the high round neck of the slate-grey gown, past the small jet cross, across the plain long sleeves and the unornamented hem, to the plain black slippers, and back. The survey took perhaps 3 seconds. Then she let a small, pretty, perfectly modulated smile go across her full red mouth, snapped the spangled fan open against her wrist, and said, in the carrying voice of a Mayfair drawing-room, "How charming! Your Grace has French guests now. I had not been told." "Mademoiselle, I trust the Yorkshire winter is bearable to one accustomed to Paris?" Lady Gertrude, who had begun to seat herself upon the small brocade chair, paused with one hand upon the arm of it. Mrs. Whittaker, at the tea-table, did not lift her eyes from the caddy, but her hand stilled over the spoon. Aurélie did not move at all. Lady Margaret, settling herself again upon the sofa with the same unhurried kindness with which she had risen, smiled gently and said, in a voice no louder than the carriage of a teaspoon upon a saucer, "Lady Cassandra, Mademoiselle Aurélie de Saint-Vrain has been a daughter of the Wraysbury parish since November 1793. She has spent the whole of her life within 10 miles of this saloon. She is no more recently of Paris than your aunt is of Aix-la-Chapelle. Mrs. Whittaker, more tea for Lady Cassandra." There was a heartbeat, one clean, audible, single heartbeat, in which the only sound in the pale green saloon was the small click of Mrs. Whittaker setting the teapot back upon its silver stand. Lady Cassandra's lashes lifted. The pretty modulated smile, for the briefest possible interval, was no longer upon her mouth at all. She had been struck, with no rudeness whatever, and in the gentlest possible turn of an English sentence, square upon the cheek, the spangled fan in her hand gave one small involuntary tremor. The deep rose silk did not stir. Lady Gertrude, who had not been a chaperone for 30 years for nothing, came in at once with the weather. "How very hard the frost has set, Lady Margaret. I had not thought to find the road from York so iron under the wheels. The horses were dragging by Wetherby." Margaret, with the same unhurried courtesy, replied that the frost had begun on Twelfth Night and had not yet lifted, and that Mr. Forsyth had reported the moor road impassable above Bolton. Mrs. Whittaker poured. The tea went round. Aurelie, her hands folded composedly in her lap, accepted her cup with a small inclination of the head. Lady Cassandra was not, however, a woman who would relinquish a field upon one stroke. She drew a slow breath, set the spangled fan upon her knee, and turned the heavy-lidded gaze upon Aurelie a second time. The smile reassembled itself. "Mademoiselle, I do beg your pardon. I had been so charmed by your air that I had quite forgot myself. That is a most unusual cut to the bodice, is it not? One sees so little wool now in town. Did Madame Davy, perhaps? Or some country mantua-maker?" Aurelie raised her clear, smoke-grey eyes from the rim of her cup. She looked at Lady Cassandra for the first time straight in the face. She did not lift her chin. She did not smile. She did not falter. She said, in clear, quiet English, with the smallest North Yorkshire softening of her vowels, "Lady Cassandra, you are very kind to remark it. Lady Margaret had it run up from a length of cloth that has been in Mrs. Whittaker's keeping since 1810. I find it warmer by Yorkshire weather than silk would be. Will you take seed cake?" Lady Cassandra took seed cake. She did so with the small mechanical grace of a woman who has been taught from the age of 7 to take what was offered at a tea-table, without lifting her eyes from the Sèvres plate. She did not return to the subject of the gown. She did not return to Paris. She drank her tea in 15 minutes and laid her cup down. Lady Gertrude carried the conversation gamely round the weather and a small civility about the raspberry fire-screens. At 3:45, Lady Cassandra rose and gave a small, formal bow of the head. Lady Margaret walked the two ladies out to the great hall. The deep rose silk went down the steps and into the landau. The carriage rolled away under the bare oaks of the avenue. Lady Margaret came back, sat upon the sofa and laid her head an inch against the back of it. "My dear, I believe she will not stay the season." Aurelie said, "I believe, madame, she will not." Mrs. Whittaker, gathering the muffin-dome, observed without lifting her eyes that there were sometimes, in a Yorkshire winter, calls of which one was very glad afterwards. Margaret laughed once, briefly, and rang for a fresh pot. Lady Cassandra Ferrers slept that night at the King's Arms in Wetherby, removed to Bath the following morning by the southbound mail, and did not return to Wraysbury that season. Word came up later, by the same Bath friend, that she had been heard to remark, across her chocolate pot upon the Royal Crescent, that Yorkshire was very provincial. The week that followed was clear and cold. Thomas was in the saddle by 10 each morning, and at his desk by 4. Aurélie read the letters of Madame de Sévigné by the South Library window after breakfast, walked in the gallery before her French lesson with Margaret, and went down to Madame Vautrin's cottage upon the Wednesday and the Saturday with Mrs. Whittaker. Thomas had been 10 weeks in his own house. He had learned, in those weeks, every road of his own home farms, every accent of his own labourers, and the precise length of his own long gallery, which was 84 feet. It was upon a cold, clear morning in the middle of January, at breakfast in the small breakfast parlour with the southeast windows unshuttered upon the white frost, that Thomas set down his coffee-cup, looked across the table at Aurélie, and said, in his measured, plain voice, Lady Margaret being already gone to her writing-desk in the next room and the door between the rooms standing discreetly half open, "Mademoiselle, Would you do me the great kindness of walking with me in the long gallery for a quarter of an hour after breakfast? I have a question to ask you which I should prefer to ask without an audience, but which I do not propose to ask in any room where we should not be observed." Aurélie set down her teacup. The small jet cross at her throat caught the cold morning light. She inclined her head. "Your Grace, I shall." They went up the principal stair together. A quarter of an hour later, she upon his right, her hand not upon his arm. He wore the dark green country coat with the buff waistcoat, buff breeches, brown-topped boots, the plain gold fob watch at his hip, the heavy gold ducal signet on his right hand. The long gallery ran the whole length of the south front of Wraysbury. 84 feet of polished oak and ivory plaster, 3 deep mullioned windows on the south side, and on the north side the line of Stanhope Ravenscourt portraits in their old gilt frames, lit from below by the high-banked fire at the far end. The frost stood thick upon the small leaded panes. The cold pale blue Yorkshire light came in through them, very clear. The long polished floor between the portraits and the windows held a still, hushed, almost ecclesiastical quiet. They walked together down the line. Aurélie did not speak. Thomas did not speak. They passed the first Stanhope in his Caroline lace, the second in his Restoration peruke, the Georgian uncle in his pink hunting coat, the great-grandfather in his garter robes. He stopped, halfway along, before the portrait that hung between the third and fourth windows. A tall woman of perhaps 30 in white muslin with a blue sash at the high waist, her dark chestnut hair simply dressed, her steady hazel-green eyes looking out of the canvas with the same down-tilt at the outer corners that Aurélie had learned to know in her sons. Mary Stanhope by Beechey, 1799. Thomas stood a full half-minute looking up at his mother. The fire crackled once at the far end of the gallery. The faint cold breath of January came past the leaded panes. He did not turn his head. He spoke quietly, looking at the portrait and not at Aurélie. "Mademoiselle, I have not, in my 33 years, met any woman whom I had wished to ask one particular question. I find that I should like to ask it now. I should like, Aurélie, to be allowed to think of you not merely as a guest in this house, but as the person I should most like to share it with. I do not ask you to answer me today. I do not ask you for any answer at all that you do not wish to give. I ask only your leave to consider you, in the privacy of my own mind, as my hope for the spring." He had not raised his voice once. He did not turn his head. The hand that hung at his side did not lift. The signet upon his right hand caught a single flicker of the firelight. Aurélie stood beside him in the firelit gallery between the portraits and the cold leaded panes, her hands folded composedly at her waist, her smoke-grey eyes upon the painted hands of Mary Stanhope. She did not move. She did not speak. The fire crackled a second time. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. The cold, pale blue light upon the polished floor between them held a clean, unhurried stillness, as though the whole long gallery were waiting upon a single sentence. She stood a full minute. She drew one slow, steady breath. She lifted her chin a quarter of an inch and turned her head a fraction, and she answered him in the voice he had first heard reading Racine from behind a reading screen, quiet, low, perfectly composed. "Your Grace, I have been at Wraysbury for 2 years, and I have never had any address from any man within the walls of this house, until you spoke to me on the Tuesday of the Feast of All Saints in your own kitchen of cold beef. I had no English name to my mother that any English man might wish to honour. You have, in 10 weeks, been the man who told me you would write to London for the name I did have. I shall not give you, in this gallery, a more particular answer than that. I shall only say, Your Grace, you have my leave." The fire crackled a third time. Thomas, after a pause that was his own, inclined his head. "Aurélie, I shall not press you. I shall wait until the snow drops." He bowed once, gravely, and did not touch her. He turned, and they walked the rest of the long gallery together, past the Garter great-grandfather, past the Georgian uncle, past the Restoration peruke, past the Caroline lace, in a silence which was no longer the silence of two strangers at all. The frost held upon the small leaded panes. The fire glowed at the far end. Their footsteps fell upon the polished oak in a slow, unhurried, even cadence, which had, by the end of the gallery, become the same cadence. At the head of the principal stair, he bowed again. She inclined her head. She went down the stair to the small saloon, where Margaret was at her writing desk in the inner room, and took up her sewing without a word. Margaret did not look up from her letter. She only laid her hand briefly across the page and let it lie for a moment, as if steadying it. 5 days afterwards, Mr. Forsyth came up to the library after dinner with the leather-bound Hookham and Thornton folder under his arm and a small, dry, almost involuntary smile upon his weathered Yorkshire face. "The French Royal Commission," he said, laying the new bundle of certified copies upon the long writing table, had acknowledged the claim. "The Picardy Parish Register entry of Aurélie's birth, the parents' marriage settlement of 1789, the certified copy of the Saint-Vrain Register, all had been laid before the commissioners and admitted. The hearing was set for the late spring. Council gave a strong, probable opinion. 'Your Grace,' Forsyth said, 'it is the first piece of London business this winter that has gone exactly as it ought.' Thomas returned the smile in the small private way that was his particular property. Aurélie, in the chair by the window with her sewing, did not lift her head. She only laid the needle a moment in the linen and let it lie. It was upon the following Tuesday morning that the small boy in the wet blue jacket came up the back drive of Wraysbury from the village with a sealed letter in his red cold hand. He had been given it, he said, by a strange groom in Granville livery at the King's Arms at 7:30, with a sixpence and instructions to lay it in the hand of the lady at Wraysbury Hall, and no other. Mrs. Whittaker, at the back door, took the letter, gave the boy a hot mug and a slice of bread and dripping at the kitchen fire, and carried the letter herself up the back stair to the blue guest chamber. Aurélie was at her writing desk by the south window in the slate-grey wool, drafting a small note to the Reverend Hawthorne upon the parish accounts. Mrs. Whittaker laid the letter at her elbow, without speaking. Aurélie looked at the seal, a thick lump of pale claret wax, stamped with a coronet over a chevron, the Granville Arms, and at the heavy, fashionable hand that had written Mademoiselle de Saint-Vrain across the front in oiled black ink, and she set the parish letter aside and broke the seal. She read the letter once. She set it upon the desk. She read it a second time. She did not put it in the fire. Sir Edward Granville, writing from Granville Priory upon the previous evening, presented his compliments. He had long held in his family papers a private memorandum, dating from his late father's time, of the Saint-Vrain inheritance, which would, he thought, if Mademoiselle was so good as to allow him to call upon her this Friday, materially advance her interest with the French Commission. He enclosed a copy of the said memorandum, a single folded page in another older hand, vague upon the dates and overstated upon the values, with two sums underlined in pencil, and signed himself, with an oily flourish of the pen, her devoted neighbour, Edward Granville. Aurélie read the memorandum once also. She folded the 2 pages together along their original creases. She rang the bell beside the desk. Mrs. Whittaker came in within the minute. Aurélie laid the folded letter and the memorandum into her hand. She said in a clear, quiet voice, no louder than the small fire upon the hearth, "Mrs. Whittaker, will you be so good as to take this to his Grace's study at once? with my compliments, and will you add, with my compliments, that I desire to be present when His Grace replies. Mrs. Whittaker, who had served at Wraysbury for 40 years, and had not in those 40 years required a sentence of an instruction repeated, inclined her head once and went out. Aurélie sat alone at the writing desk a moment in the cold, pale blue mid-morning light. The frost was upon the small leaded panes. The wharf lay iron in the dale below. She drew a clean half-sheet of paper toward her, dipped her pen, and wrote, in her clear, even hand, a single sentence. Mademoiselle de Saint-Vrain begs to acknowledge the receipt of Sir Edward Granville's letter of Monday evening, and will reply further when she is in a position to do so. She blotted it. She did not sign it. She laid it carefully in the centre of the desk, where Thomas would see it when he came up. The half-sheet to be sent only after he had read his own letter and decided, with her at his elbow, whether Sir Edward Granville should be received at Wraysbury Hall on Friday at all. She set the inkstand beside it. She set her pen across the paper. Then Aurélie took up her sewing-basket from the floor at her feet, drew out the linen and the needle, and bent her chestnut head once more above her work. The fire upon the hearth held its low, even red. The frost upon the leaded panes did not stir. Below, in the dale, the wharf ran iron between its banks. Above, on the high moor, the snow held, and somewhere along the back corridor of Wraysbury Hall, Mrs. Whittaker's brisk, practical step was carrying a folded sheet of pale claret wax toward the Duke's study door. Friday morning came up over the dale in a thin iron light, with the frost still hard upon the leaded windows of Wraysbury Hall. The bells of St. Cuthbert's struck 11 across the cold, pale air, and almost upon the last stroke, the wheels of a hired post-chaise turned in at the great gate and came slowly up between the bare oaks toward the front of the house. Mr. Forsyth, in his dark brown wool country coat, and with a leather-bound ledger under his arm, opened the door himself when the chaise drew up under the porch. From it descended, with a small, courtly step that was meant to be observed, Sir Edward Granville of Granville Priory. He was a man of 49, of middling height, perhaps 5'10", soft about the middle and rather more about the waistcoat. His thinning iron-grey hair had been carefully combed forward in the Brutus fashion over the small bald patches at either temple, and faintly oiled. His eyes were small and shallow, of a pale washed blue, set rather too close together, with a permanent, slight squint. His complexion was florid and a little broken across the nostrils, with the reddish veins that 20 winters of hard claret will lay down upon a fair undertone. His chin was weak and narrow, his upper lip long, and there sat upon his mouth a permanent, self-satisfied half-smile that did not come off either for civility or for the cold. He was dressed with the considered care of a man who had thought what he wished his appearance to argue, a deep, dark claret superfine tailcoat with heavy gilt buttons, a waistcoat of primrose yellow silk, buff doeskin pantaloons, top boots polished to a mirror with silver tassels at the knee, a quizzing glass upon a black silk ribbon swung at his breast, and from a heavy gold watch chain hung 3 large carnelian seals that struck softly together as he moved. Under his left arm he carried a flat leather portfolio, well worn at the corners. In his right hand, his hat. Mr. Forsyth took his hat and greatcoat and gave them to a footman. "Sir Edward," he said, in his level Yorkshire voice, "His Grace is at present in the long library. If you will follow me." They went together along the polished oak corridor, the carnelian seals chiming faintly at each pace, to the tall double doors of the long library in the west wing. Mr. Forsyth knocked once, opened the right-hand door, and stood aside. The room into which Sir Edward stepped had been arranged with a deliberate quietness of forethought for the conduct of a paper interview rather than a conversation. The fire on the great stone hearth burned low and steady. The long velvet curtains had been drawn back from each leaded window, so that the iron light of the dale fell evenly upon every surface. At the long writing table down the centre of the room sat Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt, 6th Duke of Ravenscourt, in plain dark blue morning coat, white cravat properly tied, black silk waistcoat, charcoal pantaloons, and polished black Hessian boots, with the heavy gold ducal signet ring of the falcon over the chevron upon his right hand. He did not rise. He inclined his head perhaps a quarter of an inch, and indicated with a small open motion of the same hand the chair set for Sir Edward upon the further side of the table. At a small rosewood table by the south window, the cold light falling clear upon her, sat Mademoiselle Aurélie Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, in plain dark blue morning gown, white lawn fichu drawn neatly to the throat, the small jet cross of her mother upon its black silk cord beneath the fichu, her hands ungloved and quietly folded upon her lap. Her chestnut hair was pinned in its smooth, low chignon. Her composed, smoke-grey eyes touched Sir Edward for the smallest civil instant, and did not change. She inclined her head a fraction. She did not rise. On a chair set at the centre of the room, Lady Margaret Stanhope sat upright in lavender silk, half mourning with white lace fichu, and a small jet brooch at her breast, her embroidery in her lap. Her shrewd hazel eyes lifted once, to take Sir Edward's measure as he came in, then lowered to her work. At the side table beneath the north window, Mr. Forsyth took his place behind the leather-bound ledger, and a thick green folder in which the letters of Hookham and Thornton of Lincoln's Inn lay open upon the topmost certified copy. He uncapped his ink bottle and laid a freshly cut quill upon a clean sheet of paper. A little behind Mr. Forsyth, against the bookcase, stood the Reverend James Hawthorne in his black clerical coat, white collar band, and small silver crucifix upon a black silk cord. He had been asked to be present as a witness, and he stood now in that capacity with the unobtrusive gravity of his profession, his clear grey eyes resting in courteous neutrality upon the door. Sir Edward took in the arrangement at a single glance, and his self-satisfied half-smile did not move. He bowed to the Duke. He bowed more deeply to Mademoiselle. He inclined his head at Lady Margaret. He affected not to perceive the steward and the clergyman, and he sat down in the chair appointed him. Thomas waited. He did not speak. He did not invite Sir Edward to begin. He merely laid his hands together upon the polished wood and waited. Sir Edward, after a small clearing of the throat that was meant to seem at ease, began his offer. He proceeded oilily and at length, in the practised flowing hand of a country baronet who had rehearsed his sentences upon the road. He had, he said, in his late father's papers, Sir Francis having died, alas, in the year 10, a private memorandum of the year 1788, drawn up at the time of the Saint-Vrain marriage settlement, and bearing materially upon the late Comte's English connections. He had also certain documents of a Bourbon period date that had come into his hands by private channels and that touched upon the present recovery in Picardy. He tapped the portfolio twice with one florid forefinger. He was content, he said, in a private capacity and out of the natural courtesy of a near neighbour, to act as Mademoiselle's legal guardian in the prosecution of the recovery of the French property. For he understood very well, as a man of the world, that ladies of her position required, in such matters, the firm hand of an English baronet of standing. He required, by way of necessary advance, for these French matters, alas, were rarely cheap, and his own estate, he was free to admit, was at the present moment a little encumbered by the carelessness of an agent he had since dismissed. A private settlement of £15,000 upon Granville Priory, in respect whereof, by way of repayment, he proposed that the recovered French property, the Château of Saint-Vrain in Picardy, the Lacroix vineyard of 100 acres, and the Paris bonds restored under the Bourbon Commission should, upon their being recovered, be settled upon him by deed in lieu of the said 15,000. He spoke of the figure with the practised lightness of a man who had named worse to better men. He smiled. He looked across at Aurélie, who did not look back, and his half-smile became more pointed. "Mademoiselle," he said with the same oiled flow, "I am, of course, mindful that the late Comte was, alas, a casualty of his own moderate views, and that the family name has a small private cloud upon it, which a settlement under an English baronet's name might in some small measure dispel. I make my offer, you understand, in part as an act of neighbourliness." The fire held its low, even red. Aurélie's smoke-grey eyes rested for one instant upon the iron line of the wharf below the window, and then returned to her hands. Thomas's expression did not change. He let the silence settle one full heartbeat. Then he spoke, in the unhurried voice of a man who had commanded a regiment of cavalry through Vittoria and Quatre Bras, and who had not in those 4 years raised his voice to give an order. "Sir Edward, Mademoiselle has been Aurélie de Saint-Vrain to me for 3 months past. As of last evening, she is also my affianced wife. Her interests are mine, and her name is going to be mine as well. The recovery of any property of hers in France is being conducted by Hookham and Thornton of Lincoln's Inn upon the deposition of Mademoiselle, the certified Picardy register, and the marriage settlement of her parents of 1789. Their counsel is at present sanguine. The French Commission has admitted the claim and set hearing for the late spring. We require no other assistance. Mr. Forsyth has the file. Mr. Forsyth, perhaps you will return Sir Edward's memorandum to him at the door, with our thanks." The Duke had not moved his hands. He had not raised his voice. He had not glanced at the leather portfolio. He had spoken his sentences flat as flagstones, and he had concluded. Sir Edward went white. The colour faded out of the broken veins above his nose and left the florid surface looking almost grey. His half-smile remained where it sat, having had no instruction to come down, but it had ceased to be a smile of any meaning. He had not counted on Thomas's having moved with such speed. He had not counted upon a private engagement entered into the night before. He had certainly not counted upon every interested party being already seated, as he now perceived they were, in this composed room. He drew a small breath and made the only attempt that remained to him. "Your Grace," he said with the air of a man who had recollected, just in time, a useful private circumstance, "I should perhaps add, for the completeness of the record, that there subsists among my late father's papers a small private memorandum of an old debt of the late Comte, dating from the spring of the year 89, in the sum of 8,000 livres, advanced upon the occasion of certain Paris arrangements. The matter has lain dormant out of delicacy, but in any settlement of the Saint-Vrain estate, it would, I conceive, properly fall to be discharged." He laid one florid hand upon the leather portfolio. Mr. Forsyth lifted his iron-grey head an exact half-inch from the green folder, and looked with steady, pale blue eyes across at the baronet. He did not rise. He spoke with the same dry level Yorkshire courtesy he had used at the front door an hour earlier. "Sir Edward, Hookham and Thornton's first communication from the Commission specifically lists every recorded debt of the late Comte de Saint-Vrain at the time of his death, and 3 months thereafter. There is no debt of 8,000 livres owing to Sir Francis Granville among them. Should one have been omitted from the Commission's schedule by reason of failure to register, the time bar under the 1814 Restoration Act has long since closed it. I should be glad to send Mr. Hookham a copy of your private memorandum for his comment, if you wish." He laid his quill quietly down upon the ledger. He waited. Sir Edward stood at a small private fork in the gravel of the road. To his right lay the visible failure of a paper trial, the Commission schedule, the time bar, the Lincoln's Inn opinion, the certified register, the deposition, the marriage settlement, the Reverend's witness, his memorandum forwarded under cover for comment. To his left lay a quiet retreat at 12 o'clock and a short carriage ride home. He chose his left, with such alacrity as a country baronet's pride permits in the hearing of a duke and a lady. He withdrew, he said, his offer. Upon reflection, he saw that the case had advanced more rapidly than he had supposed, and that his services would after all be unnecessary. Upon further reflection, here he reached for the leather portfolio. He saw that the memorandum was perhaps of more curiosity than substance, and it might therefore be best that he should take it home again and commit it, at his leisure, to such disposition as he should think proper. Thomas inclined his head. He did not speak. Sir Edward rose. He bowed stiffly toward the rosewood writing-table. Aurélie did not look at him. Her composed smoke-grey eyes were upon the iron-cold line of the dale beyond the leaded panes, where the bare ash trees stood up against the winter sky. He bowed, slightly less shortly, to Lady Margaret, who returned the bow with a small civil inclination and did not lift her eyes from her embroidery. He bowed, last, to the Duke, who returned the bow with the smallest possible inclination of the head a man can return, and yet have made a movement at all. Mr. Forsyth gathered the leather portfolio under his arm and conducted Sir Edward to the door. The carnelian seals chimed once at the threshold of the great hall and were not heard again. At the porch, the post-chaise stood waiting. Sir Edward, having received his portfolio at the carriage door with a steady Yorkshire civility that did not allow him room for a parting word, mounted the step and was driven down the long avenue of bare oaks. The stable clock struck 12 as the chaise reached the end of the drive. He never came back to Raysbury Hall. He did not appear at the wedding. The library settled. Mr. Forsyth came back along the corridor at his usual brisk pace and resumed his place at the side table. Reverend Hawthorne, who had stood against the bookcase without moving so much as a hand, stepped a pace forward and said, in his quiet scholar's voice, with the dry note that was his particular property, "That, I think, is one of the few interviews I have witnessed in which the devil quoted scripture and was caught in the very act of his omission of the footnote." Lady Margaret looked up and laughed once, a single brief, unsentimental laugh that came out of her like a struck bell, and laid her embroidery aside. Mr. Forsyth gathered the certified copies into the green folder, tied the tape, capped the ink bottle, and wiped the quill. Thomas rose. He crossed the floor of the library and went to the south window where Aurélie sat at the rosewood table. He stopped a courteous half-pace short. He spoke in his ordinary, unhurried voice that had not altered a tone in the whole of the morning. "Mademoiselle, am I correct that I asked you, in this house, last evening, in front of my sister and the Reverend, to be my wife, and that you accepted upon the same single condition you imposed upon me at our second interview, that I should not address you with impatience before the servants?" Aurélie lifted her smoke-grey eyes. She did not look away. She answered in her composed, quiet alto, level and clear. "Your Grace, I accepted upon 2 conditions. The first is the one you have named. The second is that you shall give me leave, between February and the wedding, to settle privately upon Mrs. Whittaker, upon Madame Vautrin, and upon Reverend Hawthorne, the small annuities I have already named to you. I do not ask for further dowry. The recovered French property, when it is recovered, shall be settled upon our children, if any, and, in default, upon a small French foundation in my father's memory in Picardy. We are agreed." Thomas inclined his head a fraction. Then he spoke again. "Mademoiselle, we are agreed in everything but the dowry. The dowry I propose to settle upon you is myself, in tolerable working order, and a comfortable house in Yorkshire, and a fair seat in London if you should at any future time wish one, and the use of my name upon any English document for the rest of your life. You are not to refuse it. I will not have it back." She did not lower her eyes. she said, with the small, still composure that had been hers in the kitchen, in the library, and in the long gallery. "Your Grace, I shall not refuse it. I had not proposed to." Thomas smiled then. It was the first time he had smiled in the entire interview, a small, private smile that came up out of the corner of his mouth and went no further, a smile that was for her and for no other person in the room. He bowed. He returned to his desk. Lady Margaret took up her embroidery, as if the morning had concluded itself in the manner she had supposed it would. Reverend Hawthorne, after a small civil interval, said he would walk back to the vicarage by the river path, and was gone. February at Wraysbury came in quiet and cold and slow. The frost held a fortnight upon the leaded windows. The moor lay white at the higher places. The wharf ran its iron course with the same patient indifference it had kept since November. Mr. Forsyth took the London road again upon his second errand, in a thicker greatcoat and with the green folder freshly tied. Lady Margaret unfolded a long sheet of cream paper at her writing desk and began to draft the wedding list. Aurélie had Madame Vautrin up to tea in the housekeeper's parlour twice a week, and read aloud to her in the old Picardy French of her childhood, from the small leather-bound family Bible the old nurse had kept these 22 years. The Reverend James Hawthorne drew up the parish notice for the 3 Sundays of banns to be read in March, and sent a clean copy to Wraysbury for the Duke's signature. The first snowdrops came up under the south wall of the orchard in the 3rd week of February, in a small, steady green line along the warm stones, and opened their white pendant heads to the cold, pale Yorkshire sun. In the last days of February, the Morning Post in London and the York Courant in the county set up a small 2-column notice, nearly identical in either paper, laid quietly at the foot of the social column. At Wraysbury Hall, North Riding of Yorkshire, on the 24th of January, 1816, Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt, His Grace the 6th Duke of Ravenscourt, was united in private engagement to Mademoiselle Aurélie Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, only daughter of the late Henri Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, Comte de Saint-Vrain of Picardy, and of Marianne Waverley of Wraysbury, North Yorkshire. The marriage will take place at St. Cuthbert's, Wraysbury, in the early spring. In her aunt's morning room in Lansdowne Crescent at Bath, Lady Cassandra Ferrers took up the Morning Post across the chocolate pot, read the notice once, and set the paper down beside the silver toast rack with a composed deliberateness. "The country," she remarked to her aunt, "has its little surprises." She did not return to Wraysbury that year. The Bath season carried her quietly through to April, and the chocolate pot resumed its place. It was upon a still cold afternoon of the last week in February that Thomas walked Aurélie down the long flagged path under the south wall of the orchard. He was in his dark green country coat, his head bare, she in her cream wool morning gown beneath a hooded cream cashmere cloak, the hood put back upon her shoulders, her chestnut hair smooth in the cold, pale sun. Below the warm stones, the line of snowdrops had widened and held its small, steady green and white through the lengthening February afternoons. They stopped where the line was thickest, near the cracked sundial at the south corner. Thomas looked down, and then across at her. "Aurélie, the snowdrops are out." She looked also with the same composed, smoke-grey eyes she had carried out of the kitchen and into the library 4 months past. She answered in her quiet alto, "They are. We had agreed upon the snowdrops, Your Grace." He inclined his head a fraction. "Then I propose to address Reverend Hawthorne tomorrow morning upon the question of the date." There was the smallest stillness of one breath. The cold, pale Yorkshire sun lay on the warm stones. Somewhere at the back of the kitchen garden, the under-gardener was clipping last year's lavender with a slow, even shear. "Tomorrow morning will be very well, Thomas." It was the first time she had used his Christian name aloud. He inclined his head once more, by precisely the same fraction. He did not put out his hand. He did not touch her. He turned, and she turned with him, and they walked back together along the flagged path under the south wall toward the door of the orchard. The snowdrops nodded under their feet in the cold, pale sun, and the small, steady green and white line went on along the warm stones behind them into the lengthening February afternoon. Far below in the dale, the wharf lay still, iron-cold between its banks, and above on the high moor, the last of the snow held its quiet, white line. But here, under the south wall, the season had turned by 1/2 degree, and the orchard knew it, and the woman who had carried raspberry through the winter without a word out of place knew it, and the man at her side who had asked her in his own kitchen for cold beef and an ale knew it best of all. Through the first 10 days of March, the season widened into a true Yorkshire spring. The snow went off the high moor in long pale tongues. The wharf loosed its iron and ran clear and brown again between its banks. The lambs came in upon the home farms, small and unsteady upon the wet grass. By the gate of Madame Vautrin's small stone cottage, the line of dwarf narcissi opened their pale yellow heads, 2 by 2 along the path. The snowdrops in the orchard, having had their fortnight of cold, pale glory, finished and gave their place to the first primroses. In the churchyard at St. Cuthbert's, in the dampest corner where the old hawthorn gravestones leaned a little towards the river, the first violets came out among the new grass. The sky at noon over Raisbury was a cold, pale Yorkshire blue. The rooks were noisy in the bare oaks of the long avenue, and the air smelt faintly of turned earth and of the cold, clean wind off the moor. Upon the 10th of March, the first Sunday, the Reverend James Hawthorne stood in his white linen surplice over his black cassock at the chancel step of St. Cuthbert's, the small silver crucifix on its black silk cord plain at his breast, and read for the first time the banns of marriage between Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt of this parish, bachelor, and Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain of this parish, spinster. The Saint-Vrain names fell across the small 14th-century nave with the unembarrassed gravity of a man returning a thing to its rightful place. He read the banns again upon the 17th, and again upon the 24th, which was Palm Sunday, with the small posy of pussy willow at the altar that the dame school children had brought up the day before. Upon the third reading, the church was packed to the lich gate and beyond. Mr. Forsyth stood at the back with his hat in his hand. Mrs. Whittaker sat in the housekeeper's pew beside Madame Vautrin in her best black bombazine. Lady Margaret sat in the raspberry pew, the faint, pale blue spring sun upon the lavender silk of her sleeve. Thomas sat at the head of the pew in his plain dark blue morning coat, head bowed, hands folded upon his knee. Aurélie sat beside Lady Margaret in her plain dark blue morning gown and white lawn fichu, and the small jet cross at her throat. The Reverend Hawthorne raised his head from the prayer book, looked once across the silent congregation, and gave the words, "I publish the banns of marriage between Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt of this parish, bachelor, and Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain of this parish, spinster. This is the third time of asking, if any of you know, cause or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it." He waited the proper interval. The packed congregation, in one quiet breath, gave the answer back in a single word. Amen. Mr. Forsyth afterwards, walking down the lich gate path with his hat still in his hand and the cold pale blue sun on his iron-grey head, said quietly to Mrs. Whittaker that it was the most affirmative silence he had heard in 54 years. Mrs. Whittaker said that she had known it since the Reverend had said his short word at the Christmas Eve service, but that it was very pleasant to have heard it once again from the parish itself. The week between Palm Sunday and the wedding Wednesday went quickly and slowly together. Lady Margaret sent the last of her notes by hand. Mr. Forsyth rode the home farms once over with the head shepherd. Mrs. Whittaker, in the still room, ordered a goose for Tuesday, and spoke twice with the village butcher about the 2 saddles of mutton, and once with the village baker about the 4 loaves. Madame Vautrin, in her cottage at the bottom of the village, pressed her best black bombazine flat with a hot iron, set the fresh white lace cap with the new violet ribbon upon the dresser shelf, and slept on the night of the 1st of April, with one hand upon her ebony stick at the bedside, in the manner of a woman who has waited 23 years for a particular morning and has no intention of being late to it. Wednesday, the 2nd of April 1816, came in cold and pale blue and clear over the dale. Crocuses stood in purple and gold clusters upon the village green. The bells of St. Cuthbert's at 9:30 began their long ringing across the river and the bare oaks, and the village heard them and began to come up the avenue toward the Lich Gate. Raysbury Hall had been in quiet stir since 6. Mrs. Whittaker had had every fire lit, every floor scrubbed, and the long table laid by 8:30. The kitchen had its goose upon the spit, its 2 saddles of mutton on the lower roasting jack, its 3 veal puddings rising in their basins, the 4 loaves cooling on the long pine table at which a certain young woman had once chopped onions on a wet October Tuesday, 12 cheeses up from the dairy, 6 bottles of port, and 4 of the late Duke's 1809 claret drawn by Mr. Forsyth's own hand. 2 village girls had come up at 7 and decked the great hall with primroses and hawthorn blossom. Aurelie dressed in the blue guest chamber at 9:30. The high-waisted gown of fine ivory cream silk lay upon the bed, where Mrs. Whittaker had laid it the night before, the single row of small seed pearls embroidered at the hem, catching the cold pale blue light from the leaded window. Mrs. Whittaker had kept the last white snowdrops of the season in a shallow bowl of cold water since Tuesday, and had brought them up at 6 with sprigs of pale green myrtle from the south wall. The small coronet had been made up at the work-table by the window. Aurelie sat very still upon the low stool at the dressing-glass, while Lady Margaret pinned the coronet to her chestnut hair, while Mrs. Whittaker fastened her mother's seed pearls about her throat, while Aurelie herself drew the small antique gold cross of her grandmother on its plain black silk cord up from her collarbone and settled it beneath the seed pearls, so that only the small round-cut gold disc sat warm against the linen of her shift. Then she drew on the white silk gloves, finger by finger, and stood up. Lady Margaret took the fine ivory blonde lace veil from its tissue, the heirloom Stanhope veil of 1782, kept these 34 years between sheets of fresh linen, shook it out gently in the cold pale blue light, lifted it over the chestnut hair and the small coronet, and pinned it in 2 places where it would lie steady through the long avenue of bare oaks and the Lich Gate path. She stepped back. She looked at the bride a long moment without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, "You are very beautiful, Aurelie. Your mother would have wept." Aurelie did not weep. She lifted her chin 1/4 of an inch and looked at Lady Margaret in the glass with her clear smoke-grey eyes, and put out one gloved hand and laid it upon Lady Margaret's lavender silk sleeve for a small, steady moment, and said in her quiet alto that she thought her mother would have been very glad to see Lady Margaret beside her this morning. Lady Margaret said that they had better go down for Mr. Forsyth was waiting in the great hall, and the bells had been going 20 minutes already. Mr. Forsyth stood in the great hall in his best dark brown wool country coat with a small sprig of primrose at his lapel. Mrs. Whittaker stood behind him in her black silk Sunday best with the small jet brooch at her throat. Madame Vautrin stood behind Mrs. Whittaker in her best black bombazine, white lawn fichu, fresh white lace cap with the violet ribbon, her ebony stick in her right hand. They turned, all three, as Aurelie came down the broad oak stair on Lady Margaret's arm. Mr. Forsyth stepped forward. Lady Margaret put Aurelie's gloved hand into the crook of his elbow, and Mr. Forsyth inclined his iron-grey head and said quietly that he was very honoured this morning to stand in for her father, and that he would walk her down the avenue at her own pace. They went out through the great door into the cold, pale blue morning. Aurelie on Mystère. Forsyth's arm. Lady Margaret behind in lavender silk, Mrs. Whittaker behind her in black silk, Sunday best with the small jet brooch, Madame Vautrin behind Mrs. Whittaker in black bombazine and white lace cap with the violet ribbon, her ebony stick steady upon the gravel. Down the long avenue of bare oaks, between the rooks and the cold, pale blue sky, and the slow, even ringing of the bells, the villagers stood in their Sunday clothes along either side, and cheered quietly in the low, warm Yorkshire fashion. Aurelie walked at her own pace, her chin a quarter of an inch lifted, her clear, smoke-grey eyes steady upon the open lich gate at the far end of the avenue. The lich gate was wreathed in primroses and snowdrops. The path between the leaning hawthorn gravestones was strewn with the same. The small first violets in the damp corner held their dark heads above the new grass. Mr. Forsyth paused with her at the lich gate for one breath. Aurelie looked up at him with a small, composed smile of thanks. Mr. Forsyth gave her a single firm Yorkshire nod, and they went in. St. Cuthbert's was packed to the lich gate and beyond. The pew ends had been decked with snowdrops and primroses by the dame school children that morning. The altar bore 2 tall brass candlesticks, a silver cross, and a small posy of violets. In the gallery, the Yorkshire choir of 8 stood with their music open. The pale blue spring sun came through the east window in a long, cold, gentle column and lay across the chancel and the worn flagstones. Reverend Hawthorne stood at the chancel step in his white linen surplice over his black cassock, the small silver crucifix on its black silk cord plain at his breast, the prayer book open in his hands. Thomas stood at the altar. He had chosen, with the dry gravity that only very plain people can manage, to put on once more the hussar dress uniform he had sold out of in September, out of respect, so he had said to Reverend Hawthorne in the vestry the evening before, in 3 plain sentences and not more, for the country which had guillotined her father. The dark blue cavalry tunic with its silver braid and silver buttons sat exactly upon him. The white doeskin breeches were cut close and clean. The polished black Hessian-style boots had silver tassels at the tops. The white sash with silver thread lay neat across his chest. The Ravenscourt ducal signet ring was upon his right hand. The sabre, in its plain scabbard, hung at his left side, the scabbard plain, no blade visible, the sabre never drawn and never to be drawn, that day or ever in that church. At his lapel he wore the single sprig of white snowdrop the undergardener had cut him at 6 that morning. At his breast were the small bronze Waterloo medal upon its plain ribbon and the small peninsular gold cross. He stood very straight. The cold pale blue spring sun from the east window lay along the silver braid of the tunic in a thin, even line. Reverend Hawthorne, when Thomas had come up the aisle a half-hour earlier, had glanced at the uniform once and let the smallest amused grave smile pass at the corner of his mouth, and had let it pass without remark. Mr. Forsyth walked Aurelie up the long aisle at the pace they had set upon the gravel and brought her to the chancel step at Thomas's left side. He gave her gloved hand a small, last, firm Yorkshire pressure as he laid it across into her own keeping and stepped back to the front pew. Lady Margaret took her place behind. Mrs. Whittaker and Madame Vautrin sat in the housekeeper's pew at the side. the old French nurse's left hand, laid quietly upon the housekeeper's right. Thomas turned his dark hazel-green eyes upon Aurélie for the first time that day, and inclined his head a fraction. She looked up at him with her clear, smoke-grey eyes, and for the smallest moment, in the cold, pale-blue Yorkshire sun, coming through the east window, the wet October kitchen, and the long winter library, and the snowdrop walk under the south wall were all set down quietly together at their feet. Reverend Hawthorne began the simple form of the Book of Common Prayer in his quiet clerical voice. The questions were put in their old plain order. Aurélie gave her answer at the proper place in her clear, quiet alto. "I will." Thomas gave his at the proper place in his measured baritone. "I will, and most gladly." The plain gold ring went onto the finger of the white silk glove, and Aurélie drew the glove off her left hand quietly between the words, and the ring went onto her finger proper, warm against the small bone, and stayed there. The Reverend joined their right hands above the prayer book and pronounced the old words of joining over them. They went, with the Reverend, into the small vestry to sign the register. Aurélie took the pen from the inkstand, dipped it once, and wrote the long, full name in her clear, even hand. Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain Stanhope Ravenscourt. Thomas took the pen from her gloved hand. He wrote beneath, in the plain, firm cavalry hand, "Thomas Stanhope Ravenscourt." The Reverend signed, and Mr. Forsyth signed, and Lady Margaret signed, and the register was closed. They returned to the chancel step. Reverend Hawthorne, before the recessional, lifted his eyes once over the packed congregation and gave them a short address, 3 minutes and not more, as his father would have done, naming simply the late Comte de Saint-Vrain, born 1763, gone 1793. His English wife, Marianne Waverley, born 1768, gone 1807. The late Reverend Philip Hawthorne of this parish, born 1755, gone 1813. The present Duke's late mother, Mary Stanhope, born 1769, gone 1812, and the present Duke's late father, born 1762, gone 1804. He named no other person. He commended the bride and groom to God in his quiet clerical voice, and he gave the blessing. The bells of St. Cuthbert's went up again at once over the dale, and rang for half an hour without a pause, and the whole village, standing along the long avenue of bare oaks between the Lich Gate and Raysbury Hall, threw the last of the snowdrops and small handfuls of grain at the carriage as it rolled slowly back up the avenue with the bride and the groom inside, and the rooks went up out of the bare oaks at the noise, and the cold, pale blue Yorkshire sky held over them. The wedding breakfast in the great hall at Raysbury sat 50 couples down the long table. Lady Margaret presided at the head in lavender silk. Mr. Forsyth sat at the foot, quietly delighted. Reverend Hawthorne sat to the groom's right, Madame Vautrin in the place of honour at the bride's left, her ebony stick laid beneath her chair, her white lace cap straight upon her white hair. The small Yorkshire choir gave them 4 old country airs and 1 quiet old French air. The 5 removes came up in their proper order. The port and the late Duke's 1809 claret went round. Mr. Forsyth gave the bride's health in 12 plain sentences. The Reverend gave the groom's. Lady Margaret gave Madame Vautrin's in French and in English, and Madame Vautrin lifted her small thin glass of claret and inclined her white head once, and that was all. The afternoon went on. The 50 couples drifted in 2s and 3s through the saloon and the long gallery and the south terrace in the cold, pale spring sun. The carriages began to be called for at 10. The last guest was handed up at 1:15 midnight by Mr. Forsyth. Mrs. Whittaker stood under the lantern of the great door, with her bunch of keys quiet at her waist, and saw the last carriage off down the long avenue of bare oaks. Thomas had gone upstairs at midnight and changed out of the hussar dress uniform. He came down into the great hall in a plain dark green country coat, fresh white cravat, buff waistcoat, buff breeches, brown-topped boots, the Ravenscourt signet upon his right hand, and the plain gold band of his marriage upon his left. Aurélie had drawn her cream-wool gown over the ivory cream silk wedding gown, kept her mother's seed pearls and the small antique gold cross at her throat, kept the coronet of snowdrops and myrtle pinned in her chestnut hair, and let the heirloom stanhope veil down off her shoulders into Lady Margaret's careful keeping at the head of the stair. They went out together through the side door into the moonlit deer park. The night was cold and pale blue and very still. The moon stood high over the long shoulder of the moor. The lake at the bottom of the deer park lay smooth and silver under it. They walked down the long sloping ride between the bare oaks without hurrying, his arm under hers, her gloveless hand resting lightly upon the dark green sleeve. They went down to the lake, stood at the edge of the still water, and watched the moon upon it for a long, quiet moment. Somewhere in the home park, a single tawny owl called once more, and was silent. Thomas spoke first, in the unhurried cavalry baritone he had used in the kitchen and the library. Mademoiselle Aurélie Lacroix de Saint-Vrain, Stanhope Ravenscourt, Duchess of Ravenscourt. I have, in 26 weeks, gone from being the man who took you for a kitchen maid in his own back kitchen to being the man you have just done me the honour of marrying. I should like to apologize once more, most properly and most plainly, for the cold beef and the wet greatcoat of the last Tuesday in October. Aurélie laughed. A small, clear, quiet laugh he had not yet heard in the whole of the 26 weeks. She turned her clear, smoke-grey eyes up to him in the moonlight, and answered in her quiet alto. Thomas. I had earned my hour at the chopping board that evening. The cold beef was very good. The greatcoat I held to the kitchen fire because it had come from a man whom I, for 2 years, had never seen, and whom I observed already to be soaked through to the bone, and whom I therefore determined, before I knew you were my new master at all, to dry. We shall not speak of it again. I shall, however, every 29th of October for the rest of our lives, lay a small cold collation in the kitchen for you privately, in case you should arrive home soaked. He laughed once, a small, grave, amused laugh that came up out of the corner of his mouth and went no further. The laugh of a man who has been known better than he had supposed he could be known by any person living. He took her ungloved left hand in his white-gloved manner and raised it slowly and kissed it once across the plain gold band of her marriage. He let the hand down and set it back upon his sleeve. They walked back across the deer park to the lit windows of Raysbury Hall, in step, neither of them speaking. The moon went with them along the upper edge of the bare oaks. The tawny owl called once more from the home park behind them and let them go. They came up the gravel of the south terrace and up the broad, shallow steps to the great door, where the last footman stood at his post within the open doorway. Thomas inclined his head. The footman bowed gravely. They passed in, and the last footman drew the great door of Raysbury Hall to behind them and shot the heavy iron bolt across at 1:15 in the morning of the 3rd of April, in the year of our Lord, 1816. There are mistaken identity stories that begin in a ballroom and unfold over a fan. There are mistaken identity stories that begin at a christening register. And there are rarer, slower, mistaken identity stories that begin in a wet October kitchen, when a soaked hussar in a caped greatcoat takes a quiet kitchen maid for what she has been wearing rather than what she has been reading. He was wrong about the kitchen maid. He was wrong about Phèdre. He was wrong about every assumption he had carried up the long avenue of bare oaks in the rain. He was right, by daylight inches, over 26 weeks of Yorkshire weather, to ask her at last for the longer name. The longer name was Aurélie Madeleine Marianne Lacroix de Saint-Vrain. The shorter name, after the 2nd of April 1816, was the Duchess of Ravenscourt, and the kitchen table at which the Duke of Ravenscourt had once asked the undercook's assistant for a tankard of ale stood every 29th of October for 42 years thereafter, with a cold collation laid for him, in case his Grace should arrive home soaked. And so, on a cold, pale blue Yorkshire morning of the 2nd of April, 1816, the woman the Duke had taken for a kitchen maid in October became, at last, the woman whose name he had asked her for in the library, and the bells of St. Cuthbert's rang half an hour over the dale, and the small French past and the long English future met under the lych gate of the parish she had been a daughter of since the year her father did not live to see her christened,